Hello and welcome to APUS History. Now, in this video and in upcoming videos, we will be discussing Period 2, and in this video, we will be talking about the creation of the 13 colonies, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonies, and the 3 different types of colonies and examples of early settlements. We will also talk about the effect of religion on early settlements and differentiate between Middle, New England, and Southern colonies, and also discuss some early political institutions. Alright, let's begin by contextualizing Period 2, which was from 1607 to 1754. Now, you don't need to know the exact dates, but try to form a rough timeline inside your head. Now, contextualization is a very important skill for APUSH and the AP exam, because for your LEQs and DBQs, you will be required to provide context to whatever you're talking about. So during this time, it was heavily marked by colonization. And 1607 was the first permanent English settlement. And during this time period, there was a massive amount of exchange between cultures, ideas, goods, and, of course, diseases. And also start to understand the trends going on with Native Americans during this time period. So, primarily, the colonizers tried to dominate or subjugate the Native Americans. There are exceptions, of course, but this was a rough idea of what was happening during this time. Now, so the two very common British colonies were Jamestown and Plymouth. And it's important to understand that each of the 13 colonies had their own culture and economic structure. And they were all founded in various ways with different motives as well. Now, we will talk about the transatlantic trade in more detail in another video, but just know that the transatlantic trade was very important to the formation of these colonies and to their growth. In about the 1700s, the colonies began resisting British control, which obviously led to conflict and competitions for resources. There was also conflict between the French and British over land. And the third point of context you need to know is sources of labor. You need labor to make any sort of land profitable. At first, colonizers tried to use Native Americans, however, that didn't prove to be very effective because they tended to escape very easily. So then there was another mode of labor which became widely popular, known as indentured servants. Now, indentured servants agreed to work for a set amount of time in exchange for transportation to America. And the third mode of labor was enslaved Africans. And we will talk about each of these in way greater detail in upcoming videos, but just know the trends going on during this time period. So first, we'll start off with European colonization, which was done by the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonies. And I would like to point out that I will make this video into 2 parts because it is going to be kind of long. APUSH is a pretty dense subject. So, for the Spanish colonies, know that their growth and colonization was pretty slow and stunted due to limited resources, and they had a lot of conflict with the Native Americans. For example, the Pueblo Revolt. We will talk about this in a lot of detail later, so don't worry, but just know. And the main motive for colonization was religious reform. And I've listed a few examples here. You don't need to know the very specifics of everything, but Texas was a Spanish colony along with California. Junipero Serra set up missionaries. You might have seen this on your field trips before. And then that's kind of the gist of what you need to know for Spanish colonies. Now, for French colonies, Quebec was the first French settlement, and the founder was Samuel de Champlain, who was known as the father of New France. New Orleans was also a French colony, and it became a very thriving trade center. Let's move on to the Dutch colonies. So when we're talking about the Dutch colonies, you really need to know the person, Henry Hudson. There's even a river named after him, the Hudson River. And so he claimed New York and New Amsterdam. And then we come to the British colonies, which we will talk a lot about. So the colonized lands were explored by John Cabot, and joint stock companies were used to finance colonization. And again, I remember how I talked about the interactions and relationships with Native Americans would be a very important theme and trend during this period. So for the British colonies, they did claim Native American land, but they did not intermarry. However, intermarriage was pretty common among Spanish colonies. So to begin to compare and contrast the differences between each of these colonies. All right, so this section will be the last for this part of the video. So the regions of British colonies were split into New England, which was up in the north essentially. The middle colonies, and the third one was the southern colonies. Now, each of these colonies differentiated due to geography, climate, resources, and of course, settler background. There were 3 types of colonies that you kind of need to know, which were corporate colonies. So by corporate, think of the word company. So these were controlled by joint stock companies, and a common example of this was Jamestown. Now we come to royal colonies, which were under the direct rule of the king's government. So think royal family. And then finally, we had proprietary colonies, which were under the authority of individuals who were granted charters from the king. And examples of this was Pennsylvania and Maryland. So you have 3 types. Know these because they're kind of important. So now, the English colonies represented the government, but soon feelings of independence began to brew, and that, of course, led to conflict between the king and the colonies. So again, just general trends. A quick tip about APUSH is that they are not really looking for very specific facts and details and dates, but rather to show that you understand the larger trends and themes going on in this time period. So we will actually stop with Jamestown and Plymouth today. So Jamestown was the first permanent colony in 1607, and there were a lot of early issues like malaria, and the colonizers were unaccustomed to doing all this work, and there was also Native American conflict. Few people to know: John Smith, John Rolfe, and Pocahontas, who was his wife, and they actually developed the tobacco cash crop, which was their economic wealth potion. Essentially, tobacco was one of the reasons that Jamestown became so wealthy very quickly. So next we will talk about Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. So this region was known as New England, and the people who lived and inhabited this area were mostly indentured servants. The primary reason for colonization was religious reasons and wealth. So in terms of the religious reasons, the Church of England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, and the separationists wanted a new church. And this led to search for religious freedom, and they became known as the Pilgrims. Important to remember, please write that down. They sailed for Virginia on the Mayflower, and they landed in Massachusetts, and they established the colony in Plymouth. Now, these kind of little details like the Mayflower and stuff like that could be used as outside evidence even, so just little tidbits. And they had their first Thanksgiving in 1621. Now, the next thing I kind of want to point out here is that start to compare the different colonies. For example, tobacco was the primary cash crop in Jamestown. However, lumber was the major moneymaker in Plymouth. And this could also go to the geographic differences. So in New England, this area had a lot of trees, so it's kind of obvious that lumber was one of their major moneymaker. Now, the Puritans believed that this just means Church of England. The Church of England could be reformed, so they sought religious freedom, got a charter, and they were led by a man named John Winthrop, and they founded Boston. Now, a little extra thing you need to know is that in England, there was a lot of conflict during this time and religious persecution as well. So a massive amount of people migrated from England to Massachusetts, and this phenomenon was known as the Great Migration. And in this area, it was a mix of small towns and family farms. Very important to know that, so please write that down. And we will actually stop here for today and watch the second part to go over everything else from this. All right, to recap, we talked about contextualization of the period with early settlement, sources of labor, and then we talked about European colonization specifically with the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British colonies. And then we kind of compared and contrasted between each. Then we started to focus in on a little bit more about the British colonies and the three types of colonies: corporate, royal, and proprietary. We talked about Jamestown, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay,